From FinStrat CFO, it's the Keep Going podcast with your host, Joe Hamrahi.
Welcome back to Keep Going, the podcast from FinStrat CFO, where we dive into real, unfiltered stories behind leadership, resilience, and growth of some really great people I've got to know over the years. Today, I'm joined by Keith Burton, a longtime leader in the community and in communications, widely recognized for his expertise in internal comms, leadership engagement, and guiding organizations through times of change. Keith is also a very good friend of mine, a mentor, who's taught me a lot over some difficult years, and honestly, the force behind the Keep Going name. So I'm excited to have Keith here today. Keith, welcome to the podcast, and let's jump in when you're ready.
Joe, I'm honored to be with you, and you've given me some great topics, and one of those that you gave me that I actually am honored to start with is the issue of early crossroads or early setbacks that I've had in my career, and I've been thinking about that one since you gave it to me, and I'll share it with you today. And the early part of my career was with Hill & Knowlton, when a man by the name of Robert L. Dillenschneider, or Bob Dillenschneider, was the CEO. And at that time, I was in the Dallas office of the firm, and a position became open to run it as a general manager. And when it did, I went to my peers as well as the interim general manager, and I told him that I planned to apply for it. I felt that I had put in the time, I'd done all the hard work that was necessary to step into that position, and people encouraged me to do that. And so I then reached out to Bob Dillenschneider and told him that I wanted to come have breakfast with him and talk to him about this position and make my case. And so I did. I traveled up to Manhattan. I actually went to the Pan Am building and up to the top floor where the helicopters would fly into the helipad there, and their folks would get off of those helicopters and come down for breakfast or dinner or whatever they were in town to do if they were at the Pan Am building. And so we had breakfast that morning. And as he sat down with me, he said, "Tell me why I should consider you to become the general manager of our office." And so I started telling him what I'd done to prepare, the hard work that I'd put in, and the passion that I had for being a part of the firm. And as I did so, he started doing this with his head shaking it, no. And then he looked at me and he said, "Keith, you're not ready." You can imagine how hard that hit me at that time, that morning. I just sat there with my eggs and my potatoes and bacon in front of me and put them around on the plate and tried to make idle conversation with him for the rest of the breakfast. It was one of those moments that will hit us hard when we have them. I think many of the people who may listen to this podcast would know those kind of moments. That's when ambition meets reality, and then you suddenly find there's a brick wall on the other side. I could have let that disappointment define me, but I made a choice that I was going to earn that position. I maintained and redoubled my efforts, but did so in a different way. I stopped trying to prove that I could lead, and I started trying to show people that I could learn how to lead by listening more, by focusing more on others instead of on me, and paying attention to what the people that I was leading with and worked with needed to succeed. And I wanted to put my focus on them, and that's where I placed it. That experience changed everything in my leadership. It taught me that leadership isn't about being appointed. It's about being prepared to serve. Titles come and go, but the kind of leader that we become really is about one who listens, adapts, and grows in the process. And that's what will always endure. And that's what I have spent my time doing over my career.
I think it's an interesting point, because when we're young in our careers, and especially those of us that are ambitious, and now we're further on in our careers, and we're mentoring other people from those experiences, and we see them all around us. I don't think it's a flaw. I think it's the ambition and learning to your point, learning to listen and understand and adapt to what, where you go through the process. So that's a great point, and we continue to share that with others that
Yeah.
we work with. So yeah, I kind of think that's sort of like a crossroads, but it's also a setback. So I want to just skip over one, thought that we had. But, as someone who advises leaders, how do you personally handle moments of doubt or fatigue when you're exhausted, when it feels easier to just step back and rather than push forward?
That's an interesting one. I want to talk a little bit about setback for a minute, though, because
Yeah, sure.
love this particular point. You'll remember and know the company Aramark in Philadelphia, very much known in the service business. And one year we were called, and we actually went through a review process with a number of firms to become the agency that would lead the change management effort for Aramark. And from the very start of that engagement, once we won it, it proved to be a difficult engagement for us. The executive who led the project, who had come out of McKinsey, was brilliant, but he was also very arrogant, and was determined to drive this change through a very aggressive course that was set by the outside consultants that were working with him. His focus was on control and speed, and it was not on collaboration or understanding, the two keys in my world of how we do work. On top of that, the internal dynamics of the company at that time were toxic. The COO, who was really leading the effort for Aramark, was surrounded by people who were more focused on politics and positioning than on the success of the larger organization over the months and years to come. We were under fire from the first day we got on the project, and with the timeline and the expectation that had been set, there was no path to success at all. Not one with integrity anyway. And I remember one of my colleagues who came to me at one point and said, I can't work on this project anymore. And so I had to go have a long conversation with the leader inside the firm, inside of the company about this issue. It was a humbling and a painful lesson, because I think in many firms, and you'll probably attest to this, we look to the income of clients rather than the expectations that we have for our culture and how we protect it and how we take care of our people. And so there were also conversations I had in the agency in which I served at that time as president of the company I was working under, to lead this effort and also to make sure there was an income flow from it. But when that income flow was threatened by these other issues, they became more important for me. So I put focus on values, and I said to the people that I work with, no matter how prestigious a client or how large the opportunity, the right outcomes only come from people involved who can operate with trust and ethics. And that's really what guided our work. We ended up leaving that engagement, and I'm glad we did, because we wouldn't be successful with it. It taught me to be very selective, Joe, as you understand. You and I've talked about this before, and how we choose clients and partners who lead with integrity and who want collaboration, not control. In the end, that experience shaped both our leadership as well as our success in that effort. I've never forgotten that engagement because of what it taught me.
I think you make a really good point there, because it's not even just with clients too. It's also with the integrity of leaders that you work with, around, and for.
Yes.
And what we've both, I think, come to find is that always, at some point in time, that comes back to you, or comes back to, whether it's a client. You could take the revenue stream, but later on down the line, they're gonna eventually leave you anyway, or in some fashion that's also gonna blindside you. And those are the ones that are, it's better to get out or leave earlier on your terms than it is
Yes.
necessarily on their terms. So
You ask about fatigue and how we deal with that issue. I'll just move into that issue of resilience, because I think it's very, very important for all of us today. I remind myself of the power of the pause. I call it the pause, Pause. Over the years, I've learned that real resilience is not about constant motion. It's not about movement and activity and being frenzied over things. It's about reflection, faith, and perspective. You have to have those in full measure, all three of those. I try to step back and ground myself in purpose, to reconnect with why I started and what I do today and why I continue in what I do. That process has carried me through professional and personal storms as I've lived my life over many years. I've also learned the power of prayer. I can say, as someone who is faithful in my walk, there's not a time when I've faced a real challenge, when I've gone into a new engagement or into a meeting where I have to plead a case or work on something where everything is on the line, that I don't first stop and pray for wisdom and guidance. That's what I seek in all that I do. It centers me. It reminds me that I'm not in control of everything, and it also gives me clarity and calm to lead with humility and strength. And I'd like to be around people who understand that, because that's important for us.
So how has your philosophy of leadership, communication, engagement change from when you first started to today?
I work with a tremendous researcher whose name is Dr. Robert Barrier, who lives in Philadelphia, interesting enough, to go back to the city of brotherly love. He was one of the top political pollsters working, as a matter of fact, for then President Reagan, and doing, house by house polling for him. And we took his model and began using it, Joe, for employee engagement back in the early 90s. and we created the first model that was centered on frontline employees. And so that has really set my philosophy through the years. I've spent thousands of hours interviewing frontline managers and hourly employees at companies all over the world, people who make the food we eat, the cars that we drive, the airplanes that we fly in, and those who serve in some really great organizations like NATO and NASA and the Federal Aviation Administration. I work with all of them in great companies that went through, the brands that you and I both
Yeah,
know and the people who
that's
are watching
awesome.
this podcast would know. And I'm sure many of those who may be on here will see me that I've worked with. I do this really to diagnose the issues and the barriers that cause cultures and operations to stall out, especially when we're going through times of change. Many people think it is the operational issues, and that's certainly true. But there are subtleties in those operational issues that relate to how people communicate with each other, particularly at the front line. And so, what I've learned in terms of my philosophy is that if you want truth, you've got to spend time with the men and women who do the real work, as you know. That's your
Yeah,
philosophy too, Joe.
yeah,
That's what made you who you are in the agency business, just as what made me. And they'll tell you what's working. They'll also tell you what's broken and what truly motivates them. And so this has changed my whole entire view of leadership communication. It's not about broadcasting from the top. It's
yeah.
about listening from the ground up in the work that you do. And I think the men and women who do that inside of great companies know that. And I've worked with some tremendous CEOs. I'll mention Jeff Bezos, for example. I used to work with Jeff when they were still in pro forma profitability, that era of time. And
Right.
so I would go with him out to meet with groups of 35 up to 350 people. And he was always the same, doing the very same thing, talking to people, engaging with them, listening to them, and taking that information back to his executive team to share that with them. Fred Smith from not too long ago, recently deceased now, as the CEO of FedEx. I worked closely with him as a part of the work that we did with Tom Martin over there. Fred Smith fully understood this and created the people service profits philosophy, centering first on people. If we provide great service and take care of the people first, provide great service, we can deliver profitability to our shareholders. And as long as that triad kept in that same order of people, service, profits, the company did very well. And that's what we focused our energies around in those early years of making sure that the unionization efforts around FedEx didn't destroy that. And it didn't because of the work that we were able to undertake for them. So I think we have to listen from the ground up and do that very well. And that really guides me in everything that I do still to this day.
I think we should do a whole podcast on those leaders one
We
day.
could. We could.
And all the things that we learned from that. It's interesting because we've talked about this too, Keith, and others, and we both have a similar thoughts and philosophy on this. I've always talked about working with my team and not having them work for me.
Yes.
I hate the term boss. I've always hated it. I still do. I think it's about understanding how we work together and move forward together. And I think that your answer is like spot on. And it's great also to hear about some of those leaders that you talked about too, because I don't think people all in the world and how big those companies have gotten always see that side of it and how they've, leveraged that to move forward. So that's
Yeah.
really important for our listeners too. You've talked about a few of these, so maybe this is one of them, but you already spoke about, but was there a defining challenge or failure that unexpectedly became a breakthrough for your career?
Um, Not in my early career, not even actually in those formative years or in the years that I led Inside Edge and worked so closely with all the 400 companies inside of IPG, and had an opportunity to work with them. But actually later in my time, as I've done my work, probably for me, one of the most important turning points occurred in 2022. For those of you who are listening in today, if you've ever had a personal challenge in your life, and Joe has, and I have, you'll understand this. In December of 2022, my wife had a heart attack, and it was very unexpected. She was walking our golden retriever on a Sunday afternoon and suddenly felt dizzy, and it turned out that she had a blockage in her heart, and she was taken very quickly by ambulance to the nearby hospital, and stents were placed in her coronary arteries, and they were able to, she recovered nicely from that, and they were able to protect her as a result of that. But during that time, it was for me probably one of the hardest times I had. I remember shortly after that, she was in the hospital and came home, and I was caring for her and also dealing with my client work that I had and the relationships that I still had ongoing. And I was walking the dogs on the pathway behind our house and slipped on some black ice, and I broke my wrist when I was there. And so it was like another thing to add to everything else that was going on. On top of that heavy workload that I had, I started having panic attacks. I don't think I've ever talked to you about this, but I used to have panic attacks when I was much younger, Joe, when I was a boy, as well as into my young adulthood and even through some of my formative years as an adult. I would have these panic attacks. And I came to realize later as I went through therapy that they were related to my growing up as a child of an alcoholic. They were all a part of that period of time of growing up and what I experienced there. And so that was very tough for me. It was an incredibly difficult stretch. Everything seemed to hit me at one time. And so I went through therapy. My doctor advised that I go through therapy after I'd gone in one early morning to the emergency room and had them check me and to make sure I was okay. They said, no, we want you to go through and have see the psychologist. And so I did. And I started a new process with that therapy of being very open about things that I had not really been open about before. I lived for many years, Joe. Had you met me earlier, you would have known me to be who I am now, but not really, because I wore a mask. And that mask I wore was of the competent imposter who could do everything and would do everything and would do it successfully because that was my nature. But you would never really know the true me. And I think there are people like me. One out of every five people who grows up today in the world grows up the child of an alcoholic or with a family member who's an alcoholic. In Chicago alone, that's 500,000 people today who are walking around who've grown up in that environment. So that's when I began confronting my own story, my family story, my father's alcoholism, the impact that it had on me and on my siblings, how it affected me through my childhood and into adulthood. And so writing this book that I wrote, my memoir, became very cathartic for me, but clarifying. It deepened my empathy and it reshaped how I counsel leaders today and how I face crisis as well as self-doubt. I think that's important to go through. You understand this because we've discussed it many times. It reminded me that brokenness and strength that we experience can coexist, and they often do. And sharing our truth can be really the most powerful form of leadership. There is a weight to unheard voices. I write about this. That weight is when we do not speak, then others really don't know truth. They don't know what we've been through and how it may help them. And so that's why you and I each encourage each other, I think, often to do that and share with each other what we experience because that's powerful when we do that. So that moment was one of those moments of change for me, but it was one of the most important ones. And it actually, when I went through it, actually relieved me of those panic attacks. And I've never had another one since that time because I was able to finally deal with what was below the surface of my being and who I was.
I For those who are listening, first of all, there's a lot in here that I didn't know, but thank you for sharing that, Keith, because I do know a lot that you've shared, and it's enabled me to get through some really difficult times that were for the year and a half following your situations in 2022. And I think it's important for everybody to know that we all go through this. So and it doesn't just stop. Life doesn't, is that peaks and valleys. So you don't just narrow it to 2022, 2023, or 23, 24. Keith's been very kind to share a lot of this with me. And I do, he's written this memoir, which is very powerful. And I highly recommend it to all people to see what resilience really means. And again, he and I have talked about this, and it's led to the keep going mantra that we talk
It
about
does.
constantly, and we share both in our posts and with our friends. So we will post a link when the podcast goes up to where you could buy Keith's book, because it's an not easy to read. It's easy to go through, but it's not an easy read. And I think it will resonate with a lot of people, and I think that's important. And it's also very vulnerable. So thank you for doing that for all of us.
Thank you, Joe. Joe,
Um,
there's so many human sides of what we do in leadership. You asked me to think about this, and I wanted to share a moment, a vignette with you that is so powerful still.
yeah.
I was down in Houston, Texas. I went down to meet with the executive leadership team at Shell Oil Company. I was asked to come down because they were preparing for a major reengineering project. And I had interviewed all of the members of the C-suite that morning, including the CEO. And at the end of the conversation in that boardroom, he asked me if I might accompany him back to his office. And so I said, absolutely, I will. And so we walked down a long hallway throughout this building, and every step we took, someone came up to this man who was revered and would talk to him and say how proud they were to see him that day and to be in the company. And he in turn would ask them, as he returned this warmth to them, about their families, about their work on that day and what work they'd been doing, as well as their concerns for their work. Finally, we continued on and walked all the way to his office, and he invited me in, of course, and said, please sit down, and closed the door. And as we sat down together, he said, you've met many of my people today that I work with, and you've seen all of our employees that we've been able to meet here. You've heard our issues. Now, I want to talk to you about my issues. And you can imagine how I felt at that moment, having had all the conversation we had throughout that morning, as open and transparent as it was. Here was the CEO saying, now let me tell you about my issues. What he said to me is, I love these people, the very people that we just met. But when I see them today, I look at them and I don't really know if they trust me anymore. I don't really know if they trust me anymore. That moment has stayed with me throughout the years. It's truth.
Yeah.
It's pure and unguarded truth that CEOs and leaders often have. They don't speak it very often. They can with those that are their most trusted confidants. But here was a CEO of one of the largest companies in the world admitting his deepest concern that despite everything that he had done in his position and genuine care that he'd had for the people, that he just didn't know if he shared trust with them anymore because of the changes that were underway. And it reminded me that even the most accomplished leaders, Joe, the people that you and I try to counsel, often carry their own quiet fears and their doubts. And so I think we always have to keep that in mind as leaders, that these people want to be successful, but they are like us. They have doubts and fears, and we need to encourage them. Many of these people are very resilient in execution, but they struggle emotionally is what they do. They're uncomfortable admitting it. They don't want to be seen as vulnerable. True strength is when a leader says, as you have said to me, I don't have it all figured out, but I'm here. I'm here and I keep going. That transparency builds trust faster than anything that we can do or any strategic plan can ever develop.
I love the vulnerability of that too. The theme just continues to go through it. I just want to shift a little to the mentoring aspect a bit.
Yep.
You've talked about we mentor people, you and I, and we have mentors. You are one of my mentors. So who in your career model resilience outside of this person, maybe, and determination? How do they influence, shape your leadership style beyond, the person at Shell? Is there any others that you have come across over the years?
The first person who would come to mind for me and who you know well is Bill Heyman, who is the quintessential recruiter in our business. Bill, I've always told him, and he is embarrassed when I say this to him, is the power behind the great people who lead in communications, because he's the one who in many cases identified these men and women to lead in great companies and great agencies. And that's the truth. But I admire he has a quiet strength and a humility that I don't see in other leaders. He doesn't want to be in the spotlight. But that comes from truly listening to other people, and he has that power to do that. Al Golan, who I had the opportunity to work with for many, many years at Golan Harris, then now known as Golan, taught me the power of conviction, which was very important.
Yeah.
Here he founded his own firm, used the relationship with McDonald's to create a global agency through the years, stayed the course. He told me, you always have to stay the course of the journey when others question your direction and have a conviction about what you're doing. I think that's important for us to keep in mind and not to give up. I had a great journalism professor who won the Sigma Delta Chi Top Journalism Award in 1994. When I went to SMU, he was that individual that year honored by Sigma Delta Chi for being the top journalism instructor. He taught me the importance of integrity and the relentless pursuit of truth, which I always do. Lessons that have guided me through every chapter of my life. But I will tell you, having mentioned these people, that there's something more important ahead of even those people. We always think we can learn from those who are ahead of us, but we can also learn from those who are behind us. Don't underestimate the wisdom and the power of those who are younger. I know you don't, or those that you mentor. They can teach you so much. My son Jarrett, who I just wrote a piece about that's going to appear fairly soon in a publication here, taught me resilience. After 20 years of addiction, he found his way to recovery. I watched him rebuild his life with courage and with humility and grace. And he really reshaped my understanding of what it really means to keep going. He really did. His journey has reminded me that resilience is not about perfection. It's about persistence, the willingness to rise again even when no one is watching. And so that certainly has changed me. And, even he's mentored me from below and showing me how to do these things. It's not just about passing down wisdom. It's also about staying open to wisdom that life sends back through other people at different levels.
I love that. We've talked about that so many times, and we're surrounded by some up and coming stars, and I can't wait to see what they're going to achieve because they've taught both of us so much, and thankfully we're around them quite a bit.
Yes.
And speaking of that, a lot of them are also in the position right now where some of them may feel stuck in their careers. I mean, I spoke to one last week.
It's true.
Yeah. And you've talked about it in the beginning of, in the opening here. What advice would you give them about navigating that, uncertainty or what's coming? I mean, we both know you could create the path ahead as much as you'd like to make it a straight line. It's never going to be that, right? So what advice would you give those that, are ambitious, excited, don't want to wait, but, we're experienced, see what's ahead for them.
Don't confuse motion with progress. You've told me this many times, and I agree with you. Just because people are active doesn't mean they're progressing. Sometimes what feels like being stuck is actually space where transformation begins. You have to, use that time to really analyze what's going on around you and determine how do you move forward. Take inventory of your values, ask for feedback, which, we both do, and we know people who are like us who want to really go out and encourage other people to tell us how we move forward on a particular issue. And actually act on curiosity, not on fear. I think that's the key thing. Every reinvention starts with honesty. And there are many people that you and I know who, frankly, have reinvented themselves. I'm just thinking, about the great work right now that Bob Jimenez is doing with his gallery over in Florida. You were just there recently and you visited Bob. I look forward to going down and seeing him. But here's a man who had a tremendous career as a communications leader at the highest levels and is admired by so very, very many people. One of the top Hispanic leaders in our field, in our profession, in history. And he made the decision when he left his career that he would start anew. And so he started a gallery, one of the things that he had a love and a passion for, and he's done great work in this area. Be curious. Look to things that you can do in your life. I wrote a book after I spent my whole career working in the consulting business because I had something to say that I wanted to say that would help other people. So I think it's very important to be able to be curious and to realize that there is that space where we can begin to look at the transformation that we need to make. And I think often we're too busy or we're too impatient to do that. We have to stop and do that.
And I think that Bob's a great example. And look, it's funny you bring that up because I kept saying to him, you're the example. You're giving me more validation of me reinventing myself after my career at this point in time. But but it also doesn't have to happen at a certain point. Like sometimes it's naturally a progression. And I've learned it that way. I mean, I wasn't necessarily ready. And we're seeing what Bob's doing now and the joy that it brings him and what he's doing. I mean, he couldn't stop smiling when I saw him last week. So it's really great to see that stuff.
We reinvent ourselves through change. I came to Chicago originally in 1991, Joe, to run the Ketchum office. That's why I came here, and that's what brought me here. I remember it to this day. I was failing in my leadership after the first year. I looked around. I struggled deeply with the people who were in my office. They were not necessarily the best match for the clients that we had and the things that we needed to do. I was trying to make changes with that and to add new clients into the mix, but I was failing in that process. I tried many different things to turn it around, but nothing seemed to click. And finally, what I did was to take a course that was offered in leadership by the Center for Creative Leadership in St. Petersburg, Florida. As a part of my coursework, I participated in the 360-degree feedback, where I invited the people who worked for me at that time, as well as the people who managed me and my clients to give feedback. that feedback, the real truth about who I was, Joe, at that time and how I was failing, hit home, and it hit very hard. It was not easy to hear, but I've said to people before that it changed me forever. It changed the way I've led. It changed the way that I've listened to the men and women that I work with, and the way that I really understood and understand today my own impact in the world. What it taught me is that leadership isn't about having all the answers. It really is about the courage that you've gained to face the truth about who you are. This Robert Barrier, who I mentioned to you earlier, had a
Yeah.
saying about feedback. He said, feedback is a gift, Keith. You may not like it, but the people who give it to you care enough to be honest with you and they want you to be better. And that stuck with me forever. Never forget that. That advice has really guided me in everything that I do. Seek the truth about who you are. Listen without defense. Grow from what you learn. That's where real reinvention begins. And that has been a constant for me in my life. I've tried to do new things and I like to do new things. I'm not afraid of failing in the process. I think from leading agencies to teaching at Northwestern or Syracuse or anywhere I can, to writing this book has been something that I enjoy doing because each of those chapters inspire me to let go, to embrace purpose and a new purpose in what I'm doing. So reinvent yourself when you can and rediscover what you were actually meant to be, rather than just thinking about reinvention to become something new. It's what you were meant to be, and that's what you're doing right now.
Well, thank you for that. I'm going to wrap up with two points here. So we've talked about your success, reinvention. It's not been easy. There's lots of history here, right? But
Yep.
what's maybe a sacrifice that you made along the
Wow.
way, that maybe would you make the same choice again with that sacrifice, or would you do something differently?
I was not long ago in Oak Brook, Illinois, at a hotel on a Sunday morning. There were 100 men and women in the room from Families Anonymous. These are primarily the parents of children who are addicted and in recovery or hoping to be in recovery at some point. And so I used that opportunity to have a conversation around Shadows of Sobriety, my memoir. And at the end of my talk, I began to take questions. There was a man in that audience who raised his hand and he asked me, Joe, how I'd managed a career that required so very much travel, years of heavy global work with clients. I told him about one particular summer day when I returned from Alaska. I'd been on a fishing trip with some friends, and after that had been after a year of traveling 49 weeks out of 52 weeks that year,
Wow.
mostly into New York and out of Chicago and throughout the world, in China as well as in the Middle East. When I walked into our home that particular day, I found a wooden block like you would find in an ornamental tray that had written on it, "I want to have adventures with you." My wife had left it on the counter for me, Joe. And the reason she left it for me was she wanted me to have a quiet, beautiful reminder that life's greatest adventures are not in the air or on the road, but they're with the person who's right next to you.
Oh,
And I told this story to that audience and to that man. And so I had decided that something had to change in my life. And so on that day, I made the commitment to leave the consulting work that I was doing at that time with Brunswick Group as a global partner and to return home to Chicago rather than continuing in New York and to run my own firm, which I've been doing for the past decade. It was one of the best decisions that I made because I've had all of the time that I needed and wanted with Sue to travel with her, to be with her day in, day out, and to show her the love that she has had with me through our 48 years of marriage. It's been
wow.
very important for me to do that. The man who asked the question listened very carefully to my answer, and then he tearfully said to me, I've had a successful career, but I left my family behind way too long. And he cried during that afternoon. And I said to him, I understand that pain because I've lived it. And I think many of us have gone through that. We sacrifice often and think we're doing what's good and right for our
Yeah.
families. And at times, maybe there are better ways to approach it with our family. I learned that with my wife. She is a very astute and wise woman. And that day she left that block for me, showed me there's a better way to do the things that I've been doing. And I'm very proud that I was able to make that choice to be with her and spend that time with her.
Wow, that's extremely powerful. Again, more things I'm learning as we talk through this, and thank you for that.
Yeah.
As we wrap this up here, first of all, thank you again for doing this today. And of course, you and I will talk every week for the next several weeks that we talk
Yes, we will.
about. But just for the last, for our listeners, when you look back on your career, what do you hope people will say about the way Keith Burton showed up in day to day, but also in the moments of, adversity?
I hope they'll say that I listened deeply, that I led with empathy and courage, which I seek to do every day, that I helped others to find their voice, especially when life has tested their own voice. I think that's important for us to find that. Those are the things that guide me. I really love working with other people. And I most often, and you know this about me, and I think others do too, when I have a conversation, I spend a lot of time listening and encouraging because that's what I like to do. I think we all need that.
Thank you for this. And you're right, you do. I always feel like I should be listening more to you. And today I had that opportunity and
Thank you.
I love hearing it. And I am sure that our listeners are going to love hearing it too. There's so many lessons in what Keith has taught me over the past 2 or 3 years. And again, I will say it, till I'm blue in the face. There's a couple of people behind the keep going mantra that I've adopted, and which is now the name of this podcast. One we'll have on as a guest later on, but Keith is one that has keeps reminding me and reminding me through some difficult times that each day, each step is important. So thank you for being there for me. Thank you for keeping us all going. Seems like there's a lot of people in your life you kept going with you. So
Let me remind you that keep going means to lead with heart. And I hope your listeners know that. That's what it means to lead with heart. Even when it's a heavy time, lead with your heart. It's knowing the story is not over. It's just turning the page at this point. And resilience is not about bouncing back. I think it's about moving forward with clarity as well as with compassion for other people. So thank you for inviting me to be with you today.
thanks, Keith.